Welcome back. I hope you had a good break. My name is Kevin Hector. I teach here, and it's an honor I get to introduce this panel, the panelists as well as the themes. I'll enunciate the themes for the panel first, then I will introduce our really just wonderful panelists. I'm so excited about this. Then we'll hear from each of them, and we'll have a chance to have a discussion. So here are the three big questions guiding this panel. First, in what ways is the definition of the human at stake for each of you in your exploration of your term? Second, is there space for transcultural definitions of memory, reason, and faith? And third, each of you work with different methods: anthropological, literary, philosophical. How do these disciplines color your relationship to the topic you considered, or how should they? And I'm inclined to add an additional question. And in what sense are they critical methods in the study of religion? So those are some of the questions that they will consider, as well as the topics that they have written on and that they'll prepare on. So let me introduce our panelists. First, we have Professor Alireza Doostdar. Professor Doostdar is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and the Anthropology of Religion here at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Professor Doostdar is broadly interested in religious reason and its entanglements with science and the state. His primary focus is on Shia Islam, which he approaches as a dynamic tradition shaped in dialogue with other religious and secular formations. As a West Asia specialist, he has conducted most of his ethnographic and archival investigations in Iran, but he situates the phenomena he studies in relation to global circulations that take his research far beyond Iran's national borders. Then we will hear from Ryan Coyne. Ryan Coyne is Associate Professor of the Philosophy of Religions and Theology here at the Divinity School. Professor Coyne studies the relationship between modern European philosophy and the history of Christian theology. His research thus far has focused on the history of phenomenology, hermeneutics, and deconstruction. Professor Coyne's teaching generally focuses on the themes of subjectivity, temporality, and the nature of religious experience as they appear in ancient, medieval, and modern texts. That's a lot. You're very learned. His long-standing interests include Christian mysticism, the history of Augustinian theology, and Freudian psychoanalysis. And finally, we will get to hear from Professor Constance Furey, who is the Ruth N. Halls Professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington. Professor Furey's research focuses on the intersection of theology and literature, with particular interest in questions of relationality and imagined communities. Her most recent books focus on the poetics of faith and devotion. So there's a book entitled Poetic Relations, Faith and Intimacy in the English Reformation, as well as a co-authored book, Devotion, 3 Inquiries in Religion, Literature, and Political Imagination. Professor Furey's current works include a book called Objects of Teaching, a book written collaboratively with a graduate school friend, Rebecca Schorsch. She's also working on a book tentatively titled Fragments of Strangeness, Unstately Utopias in the Early Modern Atlantic World. That's a great title, I like it. Professor Furey is co-founder of the Center for Religion and the Human, funded by a major grant from the Luce Foundation, and director of 2 initiatives at the CRH, the Teaching Religion in Public Initiative and the Being Human Institute for Emerging Scholars. So, as I said, it is an honor for me to be up here just to introduce them. I'm excited to hear their papers, so without further ado, I turn it over to our speakers.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's great to be here. Thank you, Sarah, for pulling this wonderful group together. Thank you, Emily Cruz, for all the heroic work you've done, and the Marty Center team for everything they've done to make this work. So I'm gonna. So the entry that I wrote for this volume is called Reason, and the way I'm gonna structure my brief, hopefully not too long, remarks today is in 3 different steps. The first and the third step are to say some things that I don't say in the entry. And the first one is a little bit by way of contextualization, and the third one is a bit by way of regret. And in the middle, I'll talk about what I do say in the essay. So the reason, when Sarah asked me to write the reason entry, it occurred to me that seeing the list of other entries that people were working on, that reason was one of the few that has a pretty direct connection to the first edition with the entry on rationality. And I was long interested in the rationality debates, and I sometimes teach a class called Magic, Science, and Religion, where the rationality debates come up in some way. For those of you who don't know, these are debates from I would say, like, mostly in the 70s and 80s, but going further back in time, and to some extent continuing after the 80s. But they really defined, I think, discussions around, in particular, science and religion relations, but other things, what counts as religion as opposed to science, or as opposed to magic, and other conversations. Universalism versus relativism and things like this, and those conversations made their way into, and were really central to the writing of the rationality essay by Paul Stoller, an anthropologist, in the first edition of Critical Terms. So I kind of felt like I have to decide why an entry on reason needs to be written, and what am I trying to do that is not what Paul Stoller did, and is it worth doing that thing? So I want to start with that, and then talk about what actually does, what I actually do, and then what I end up sort of not being so happy with in the end. So Stoller, as I was saying, he's an anthropologist very well known for his work on sorcery in the Niger, if I'm remembering correctly, in Africa, and he's known as a phenomenological anthropologist. One of the things he's famous for is a claim he makes to have actually practiced sorcery and possibly having killed someone with it. And so there's he's among anthropologists who work on magic and sorcery, he kind of, if there are different camps, he's closer to what anthropologists sometimes derogatorily call going native. And I wouldn't quite put him, fully in a sort of a native category, but that's sometimes the way that he's described. And I think he does a really fabulous job in the entry in the first edition. Kind of going over the rationality debates and what the position of universalists were, what the relativists were arguing. And eventually making his case for what he calls an embodied and a phenomenological approach to rationality. A fundamental point that he makes is that the universalists, in particular in the rationality debates, and so very briefly, what this debate was, what was at issue in this debate was, how do we judge the rationality of cultural beliefs? And kind of in a sort of a implicated way, cultural practices. And religion was, of course, central to this. The way that rationalists, he says, or universalists, the way that they defined rationality was essentially in terms of logical coherence. And then the relativists argued that there is no universal yardstick for coherence, or even for logical consistency. And you need to look at the specific context, the specific cultural worlds in which something is deemed rational or not rational. Stoller kind of looks at the benefits and shortcomings of those different positions, and then ultimately says, well, what both of these perspectives miss is the role of the body and of the role of experience. And we have to realize that what makes sense and what is coherent for people really has to do with the way that they encounter the world. There's no singular way of encountering the world, so we have to really grasp the rationality of lived experience through the lived experience, like in the context of the lived experience itself. He has a sentence, which I want to read out to you. It's towards the end of the essay. he says, to accept an embodied rationality is to eject the conceit of control in which mind and body, self and other are considered separate. It is indeed a humbling experience to recognize, like wise Sangha sorcerers and griots, storytellers, that one does not master sorcery, history, or knowledge. Rather, it is sorcery, history, and knowledge that master us. To accept an embodied rationality is like the Sangha spirit medium or diviner, to lend one's body to the world and accept its complexities, tastes, structures, and smells. So by the end of this essay, he gets really far, I think, from kind of the accepted or the sort of the culturally hegemonic conception of what rationality even is. And he ends up on a note of saying that we should be humble and we should be open to and in awe of different possibilities for living. Right? That's kind of like the way that and in awe of, in the sense of appreciate with a sense of wonder and with surprise, like the different forms of living that we might encounter, which I think is a message that is I'm fully on board with, and I really appreciate. What dissatisfied me about it was that ultimately I think rationality loses any kind of critical purchase with the piece. I mean, what he ends up, I think, very successfully doing is to kind of undermine from within the evaluative impulse of the rationality debates, which was to say that the impulse to judge whether one particular form of life is coherent or is logically consistent, rational, or it's not, right? And at stake in some of these debates were civilizational questions, right? Is there something that recommends Western scientific reason, let's say, about, I don't know, magical thinking or whatever you might, however you might describe it this was not always called out, but the global South, right? So this, and I think what he does very well is to say, no, there's something to appreciate regardless of what world you're looking at, and this whole evaluative project is not worth pursuing. Again, like I feel to my mind, this is a worthwhile message, but it ends up not really being about rationality. So the approach that I take in this essay is, and I think the thing that really Stoller doesn't do, and the people engaged in the rationality debates and much of the work that was done on rationality, regardless of whether they made a direct contribution to that debate or not, we're not really concerned with, which is about reason and reasoning as social activities. Right? Regardless of whether we, and the standards by which we decide as analysts whether something is rational or not, it seems to be the case that people reason everywhere in the world, and they don't reason the same way. And it's worthwhile to ask how it is that people reason, to put modes of reasoning in comparison with one another, and to come up with an apparatus for thinking seriously about what it is to reason in different contexts. So, to answer one of the questions that Sarah posed to us, I think already here there's on my part, there's a wager that there is something universal, and there's something universally human about reason at stake here, which is that everybody reasons. Not that everybody is rational. I don't quite know if I can say what that is in a universal sense, but that everybody seems to, it's just observable as an empirical fact that everybody engages in reasoning. And a very basic way, I think, so I'm an anthropologist, and the very basic way I think that anthropologists at least encounter this is, as soon as you're working with a group of people and you ask them, you see something, they say something, and you ask why. And that why question gets a response. The why question does not just kind of appear perplexing. People might ask, why are you even asking me why? But already by asking that, they're entering into a form of reasoning. So I think insofar as that's the case, at a very basic level, at a very basic observable level, it seems that people engage in reasoning. And that's the place where I begin in this essay. I don't begin by saying what rationality is or what even reason is, in the sense of a faculty or a capacity, I say we can observe reasoning as a social activity. And then my wager is that by examining reasoning as a social activity and by asking what that is in different contexts, then we can, it's possible that we can arrive at different conceptions of what reason is as well, as a faculty or as a capacity. And that this is not going to be the same thing. It's not even going to be the same thing in one particular society over time, right? The conception of what counts as reason is going to differ. So for me, what is primarily at stake is reason as a verb, as a doing, and as a doing that is social, which is really a repetitive thing to say because any kind of doing is social. But for me, it's a way of just marking off reasoning as an activity that is not only psychological. It's not only something that happens in the mind. It's something that happens with other people. And then there's a third meaning of, so reason as a verb, reason as a noun, what is reason as a capacity, and then there's reason as, justifications that are given. So reasons, right, reasons that are given for something. Of course, those are also going to be at stake, and what kinds of reasons are admissible in different forms of reasoning, again, are going to be different. I came up with I came up with a tentative definition, and I felt already kind of apprehensive about doing this, but I was like, whatever, I'll do it. And maybe I don't know how I can show this on this screen. Is there a way to just plug this into my own laptop? It's not a huge deal if I don't. I'll just read it out to you. And you'll see here, if any of you have read Clifford Geertz's Religion as a Cultural System, I'm kind of making a nod to that essay, which partly I was apprehensive about because I have a lot of problems with that essay. And I have a lot of problems with the very work that is done by Geertz in that essay, the attempt to define religion as this kind of bounded thing. But I think it's also been an extremely generative and productive thing that Geertz did, and my attempt was to say, well, I can suggest something as a kind of a heuristic suggestion. Here's a way that we can think about reasoning as a social activity. Here's some parts that it has, and then see what work this does. See what people take up and what people maybe push back against. So what I suggested was that religion is, and it's a sentence with 5 components, a discursive activity in which people reflect on something, 1. 2, of theoretical or practical interest. 3, to form, justify, or explore some opinion, understanding, or practice. 4, in accordance with one or more styles. 5, in the course of building and inhabiting a valued form of life. So that's the sort of the full thing that I present. And again, my thought wasn't that this is, that this is all that reasoning is, but that it's as much as I could that I could think of. Like the more I was like, can I think of anything else that reasoning is? And I was like, okay, here's what it is.
If we think of something, you add it to.
Yes, you can add it to. In fact, there's something that I later thought of, like today, a couple of days ago. I was like, hey, did I include this? And I feel like I did to some extent, but I'll talk about it in a bit. So what are these different components? As fast as I can. A discursive activity in which people reflect on something. Right off the bat, I'm trying to say reasoning involves language. It's about language use, and so in a sense, this is already somewhat pushing back against Stoller, where he says it's just an embodied way of relating to the world. Nowhere do I say that reasoning does not involve the body. It does involve the body. But the act of reasoning seems to really require language, right? It requires constructing sentences, and so I really want to emphasize this, and I talk a little bit about the way that in the Islamic tradition, kind of the notion of so there's a verse of the Quran that I begin with where God says, is addressing the unbelievers and says that they are people who are blind, deaf, and mute. And then the word is that they do not use their reason. One translation of it is, and I say, well, there's an intriguing suggestion here that being mute has something to do with, or speaking has something to do with use of one's reason, which of course calls up the concept of logos and logic and so on. And so there seems to be this kind of understanding, at least in the founding text of the Islamic tradition, that using one's reason has something to do, at least, with speaking. Now, I'm not going to get a lot into this, but I do make a distinction here between also discursive reasoning and intuitive reasoning, where intuitive reasoning does not necessarily need language. And the ways that intuitive reasoning and discursive reasoning are entangled with one another, the work that's been done on intuitive reasoning in a vast array of different fields, from animal psychology to child psychology to neuroscience to robotics and computer science, artificial intelligence, and so on. And ultimately, I say, the kind of the specific, the more restricted sense of reasoning that I'm interested in is of the discursive variety, even though the intuitive kind of hovers in the background and, of course, cannot be entirely separated from it. And then if it's, so this reasoning is of theoretical or practical interest, that's number two, which means that, my focus here is on religious reasoning, and often that's about the way that things are, what is not, what qualities things have, like, I don't know, divine attributes, or what is forbidden and what is not, like what is pure and what is impure in jurisprudence, and so on and so forth. There's a theoretical dimension, and then there are practical questions that reasoning is engaged in. What must be done, right? How must we act in the world? And of course, again, those two things are never entirely separate from one another. The theoretical is always implicated in the practical, and the practical both depends on a theoretical reflection and, in a sense, can be said to prime theoretical reflection, insofar as, for instance, I draw on William Wainwright's work to some extent on this, and anthropologists who work on cultivation of the body, the way that the ability to engage in certain forms of reasoning and the ability to apprehend reasons depends on one being disposed in a certain way, and that those dispositions depend on cultivation of affects and bodily attunement and sensory attunement and so on. So that's number two. Number three is what is reasoning involved in? Is to form, justify, or explore some opinion, understanding, or practice. Here, what I do is I start out by saying that often, and this is what most studies of reasoning have paid attention to, reasoning is involved in defending some doctrine. I just call it doctrine defending. I think it's something like this, like doctrine justifying or something like that, or dogma justifying reasoning. But that's not all it does. Often reasoning is involved in some process of exploration or discovery. And I suggest that it's helpful to draw on this distinction made by philosophers of science between the context of justification and the context of discovery, and to say that, to give some examples of the ways in which what we think of as religious reasoning, whether that's theological or jurisprudential or philosophical or exegetical or whatever, that they're not just about justifying things that one is already committed to, but they could also be about discovering new things. And so there's an element of openness and an element of unexpectedness in reasoning that I want to draw attention to here. Even in contexts where it seems like some of the contexts that I'm interested in, where the author seems most averse to the possibility of or to the potentials of discursive reasoning. So I look at an example is Shahabuddin Sohrawardi, the Islamic illuminationist philosopher of the 11th to 12th century, and where he talks about direct apprehension of the divine as something that cannot be attained through reason. And yet I'm suggesting, well, there's a way in which you can think about reasoning of a certain sort that he engages in that might have primed his mystical intuitions to have come to him in a particular way. So here the context of discovery, I think is helpful to look at. And then in accordance with one or more styles. So reasoning, there's not one kind of reasoning. There's not one form of reasoning or one style of reasoning. And style here I use in two different senses. On the one hand, one can think of form, poetics, genre. So we see there's quite a bit of work on storytelling and the reasoning that goes into storytelling. Storytelling as a mode of philosophizing, and so on. One can think about all kinds of examples of this. But then I spend most of my time talking about styles of reasoning in the sense developed by Ian Hacking, the philosopher of science. So Hacking has this influential formulation of the concept of a style of reasoning where he argues that the most interesting statements, the most interesting scientific statements are only true or false, and he puts those two together, are only true or false within particular styles of reasoning, right? So more boring sentences are not like that. So I don't know, this thing is, well, I don't know. So the marker color here is black, right? Like simple sort of sensory things are not, they don't quite kind of come under this conception of style of reasoning. But to say something like, there's a 20% chance that it'll rain today. That argument, that statement is a statistical statement, and it can only be true or false through statistical reasoning. If you want to counter what I just said, you need to argue statistically, right? He doesn't say that statistical reasoning makes it true. He says statistical reasoning makes it true or false, right? So I argue that there's ways that you can look at this in all kinds of different religious disciplines of inquiry. If you look at jurisprudence in the Islamic tradition, the way that grammar, for instance, functions. There's grammatical forms of reasoning that influence jurisprudential thought, and I make a point that the kind of the style is not the same thing as the discipline, right? It's not that there's a jurisprudential style of reasoning. No, jurisprudence is made up of multiple styles of reasoning, and those styles of reasoning can come together to form different disciplines. And those are important to pay attention to. I forgot to say something about the previous section about context of discovery. So reasoning as inquiry, that's really significant for me, is to say the sort of the open-endedness and the possibility for and its expansiveness depend on it not just being dogmatic or justificatory, but also as a kind of an inquiry. And then finally, this reasoning happens, and here I make a distinction between religious reasoning and certain other kinds of reasoning, like laboratory style, say scientific reasoning in the modern period, that this reasoning takes place in the course of building and inhabiting a valued form of life. So life is at stake. Life with one another is at stake in reasoning. And many different questions come up here. The question of power comes up here in the sense of, well, what even makes something a justified style or not? What is it that counts as admissible as an admissible reason, or what doesn't count, and so on. But the point that I make here is that it's helpful to think of reasoning as an invitation, and here I draw on Simon Ladle's work on reasoning, Reasoning: A Social Picture is the name of the book. That we can think of reasoning as an invitation to live a certain kind of life, or to invite people into a kind of a world to live with one. And that however, this also runs into, this kind of world building aspect of reasoning can both be taken up and run into friction with the forms of reason that are operative in the modern state. And here I look at instrumental and bureaucratic forms of reasoning. And I have this example that kind of runs through the essay. It's an example from a religious textbook in Iran of, it's a kind of like a theological argument for why sense evidence cannot be used to disprove the existence of God. And I make the point that it matters that this is a religious textbook created by a state ministry. And I won't give away why that is, but you can read the entry if you want. And ultimately, I say that there's a danger in religious reasoning that if it gets reoriented towards a secular horizon, there's a way in which the kind of life that it's supposed to try to build might be undermined or warped beyond recognition, in the way that I think is happening with that religious textbook, for instance. Okay, I'm almost done. I wrote this thing 4 years ago. Which tells you something about the publishing pipeline. Sorry, grad students. I thought it was 3 years ago, and then I looked at my emails, and the first version was 4 years, and the last version was not that different from the first version. So most of the things I said were in the first one. And I was looking at this, and I'm glad a number of you have been talking about contemporary politics. I was like, this sounds so quaint to me. Like, if I were to write this today, like, what would I do differently? And I think the thing that I'm unhappy with, and this is like a 6,000 word essay. There's only so much you can do. But I think the thing let me back up very briefly. One thing I tried to do in engaging, in my mind, engaging with Stoller, I don't really mention him in the essay, is what I tried to do was to say, I don't think reasoning is everything. In fact, I think reasoning has a very limited place in religious traditions, and it's important, though, to understand that limited place in as sophisticated a way as possible. And I do talk about some of those limitations, like, it's not necessarily valorized as the most useful mode of apprehending things in every tradition. There's very significant limits to what it can achieve, and so on and so forth. One only needs to look at negative theology or the mystical traditions to kind of see what some of those limits are, or questions of faith, for instance, and does that or does it not run into friction with reason? So for me, part of what I was trying to do, and I don't really say this except briefly here or there, was to put really reason in its place. It does have a place, and that place cannot be kind of this all-subsuming thing, but it also has limits, and one has to also understand those limits. So, but looking at this after 4 years, I think unreason is something that I would have liked to pay more attention to, and there were points when Sarah would say, "Oh, you have an opportunity to revise this," and I was like, "Should I look at, for instance, fake news or conspiracy theories and all of these things?" And I decided not to, and we can talk about why maybe I made that choice. But the place where kind of really struck me was just in the past year, and it occurred to me that the attention that I had paid to the state and state reason, the instrumental and bureaucratic rationality that I was interested in, I very explicitly say I'm looking at it in a biopolitical mode. So in the sense of the politics of life, of management of life. And in my case, it's about managing scarce resources, like a religion textbook that you have to take a test on, and it determines whether you get into a good university or not, right? Like that kind of biopolitical operation. Much less attention to the politics of death, right? So much less attention to necropolitics, and it occurred to me that something that we've been seeing over the past year is a really strange but also familiar conjuncture of rationality and unreason together. So in the way that the state, I'm thinking of the American state, but not only, has been operating. On the one hand, the sort of rationale, like instrumental rationality on drugs, on cocaine, like of murder, right? Like the way that AI is used to target journalists, for instance, in Palestine, in Gaza. Or like, sort of this kind of friend, sort of like the Netflix, here, what movie would you like to watch next operation that is being used to target like the next house that is bombed. So like that kind of rationality on drugs. But then on the flip side of unreason, so these are the best, some of the smartest people are working on these kinds of technologies, with the biggest grants. But then the unreason, which is the kind of unreason whereby, whether that's in terms of deception, or whether it's in terms of lies, or whether it's in terms of all the sort of psychic moves that we're familiar with from Freud, projection and kind of disavowal and so on and so forth. And it occurred to me that if I were to write this again, I might have to engage with something like Adorno and Horkheimer and the dialectics of enlightenment, and the way that sort of reason and unreason, irrationality and myth on one side, and kind of the working out of the logic of instrumental rationality sort of are wed together. And on the flip side, it seemed to me like some of the responses to that, like to me, I think the thing, I've been thinking about this a lot, just how do people continue to live as they are on the receiving end of this kind of instrumental reason on coke, is not through reason, it seems to me, right? It seems to me that it's faith more than anything that is at issue, like in some of the ways that people actually make do with this. So I think if I were to kind of, either write a part two or kind of rethink this, it would be to ask, what are the limits of reason? Not just what are the limits of reason, but how do we think about this kind of, on the one hand, strange conjuncture of reason and unreason as it operates at a state level, and then the way that people make livable lives, not through engaging in reasoning of the sort that I've been interested in here, of discursive reasoning through which people build a shared life, but primarily through faith. I think that's a question that kind of bothers me, and that I wish I had done something with, but that anyway, maybe for sometime in the future. Thank you.
I'm really glad you ended with that question, because I've been looking forward to this panel for so long now for so many reasons. But it seems to me that we got to this point where, at the end of that presentation, where one of the salient questions that I've heard over the past few hours was really posed in I think a really interesting and provocative way. The question of the relationship between reason and unreason, and how one makes how we all make livable lives now in the current circumstance. So I want to begin just by saying that I want to pick up on that question and run with it a little bit, and to begin by expressing my gratitude to Sarah Hammerschlag and to everybody at the Marty Center for making today possible. For me, it's been a great joy to reread all of the pieces in the volume leading up to this conference, and especially to read the pieces by my interlocutors on this panel. So what I wanted to do is, in the spirit of conversation, is not to read a set of remarks to you, but not to improvise, but more or less improvise a set of remarks to sustain a conversation. Sarah, you mentioned at the beginning of the day, I think you used the word, the great conversation, which I can't help but associate with Robert Maynard Hutchins, in maybe a dated sense. But for me, the great joy of this day is conversation, right? And so on that regard, let me just say, I plan to say just a few words about how my essay on memory was set up, how I went through it, but also to explain, to elaborate on it to a certain extent, because I'm quite conscious of its limitations. Like Alireza, I'm conscious of the fact that I've moved on in some ways, right? And I'm thinking a little bit differently about the salient issues that are involved in the piece. And I want to say a few words about that as a way, again, of sustaining conversation. So memory. When I wrote this piece, I started with the assumption that one of my tasks was to ask to what extent memory was already functioning in and around religious studies as a critical term. So I began with the question of how it is constituted as a concept in humanistic and social scientific discourse, and how that constitution feeds into and is nourished by and informed by religious studies. And in that regard, I find myself on sort of the same playing field as Constance and as Alireza, because it seems to me that the major use of the term memory in humanistic and social scientific discourse is tagged to this massive proliferation of it's not a subdiscipline, but it's an interdisciplinary subfield, memory studies. In that field, I think what you see is an attention to memory as a collective endeavor rather than an individual affair, right? So Constance in her piece talks about faith as a form of social cohesion, and Alireza in his piece talks about reason as a social activity. I think this is true about memory as well. So I started with that concept, collective memory. Now, what you see, I think, in memory studies and in the use of collective memory, there are several tendencies, I think, in the field that I found strange and quite interesting. The first is that there is a basic contradiction. If you look at all this material on a collective memory, on the one hand, scholars talk about the ubiquity of memory practices in our world by way of all sorts of institutions, museums and the like, and at the same time that there's a sort of presentism in our culture in general, so that memory is simultaneously ubiquitous and not being practiced in a certain way. So that paradox, it seems to me, is simply something that the field acknowledges and is trying to work through. So I wanted to highlight that contradiction. The second thing is that there is a tendency in memory studies to think about memory as a term that more or less can be used to define almost exhaustively religion in a certain way, that memory blends into religion and stands in for it. Constance uses the phrase in her piece when she's talking about faith, she says this about faith as well, that it's a synecdoche for religion, that the two become synonymous. Faith, good faith is religion, religion is good faith. I see a similar tendency in memory studies, but it was very interesting for me to discover, looking through this material, that it's not memory as such that is used to define religion in this subdiscipline in memory studies. It's memory as fixation. And I found that very interesting, because there is the tendency, I think, on the part of people working in memory studies to think about religion, whether they intend to or not, as something that is of the past. Aristotle says that memory is of the past. But here, insofar as we're defining religion by way of memory or as a memory practice, there is an assumption, I think, that, and there's an underlying functionalism here in memory studies, that religion is an artifact of a time or a period which we've now gotten past. And so what we see is a relic from the past insofar as we're talking about religion. There is also, I think, insofar as there's this blending together of memory and religion in this literature, I think there is a way in which that reinscribes the privileging in the field of religious studies, the privileging of certain scriptural traditions. So it's not a religion as such that is definable in terms of memory, but it is specifically Christianity, Judaism, and Islam that are prioritized insofar as we're talking about religion in terms of memory. So I found, in short, that I was deeply dissatisfied with memory as a critical term insofar as it was used in memory studies, right? So that led me to this place where I thought, okay, well, where in religious studies do you find a productive, critical use of the concept of memory? And here there is, I think, a somewhat underdeveloped defense on my part of the genealogical method in the second half of my essay. And specifically, I make this argument that when I'm reading Nietzsche and Foucault, and here I want to come back to Amy Hollywood's comments about Foucault and about the polymorphous nature of power as theorized by Foucault, that the very promise of genealogy as a method, as an attitude, as a style of reasoning, to use Alireza's phrase, is bound up in this concept in Foucault's work that is, I think, is under-theorized itself, that is the notion of a counter-memory. right? So what is a counter memory for Foucault? So here, this is the aspect of the essay that I want to mark as in need of further development. But also I want to say a few words about how that might play out and why I chose to sort of put a finer point on this issue of the counter memory. And so let me just begin by saying that I find myself strongly in agreement with Amy Hollywood on two key points. The first point is that we have come nowhere close to exhausting the resources in Nietzsche and Foucault for theorizing power. And that these two authors, and by extension, genealogy is the style of reasoning, are still, well, let me just say, these two authors are still our contemporaries in some way, in I think, a very important way. As Amy Hollywood argues, Foucault continues to offer strategies and tactics with which we can name and criticize the myth of sovereignty, to recognize the polymorphous nature of power, and to enable different voices to speak alongside of more familiar interlocutors. So I want to voice my very strong agreements with this argument in Amy's piece, right? But also there's a second argument in Amy's piece that strikes me as quite provocative and interesting, which is, and I agree with it as well, which is that in crucial ways and in crucial moments, Foucault himself is displacing, minimizing, and in some ways erasing religion and the study of religion from the stories and he wants to tell about the nature of power and modernity. And I think that erasure is something that I saw very much foregrounded, of course, in Amy's piece. Of course, we know very well that the later Foucault works on, in the fourth volume of History of Sexuality, is working on the nature of confession, the history of Christianity, exomolegesis and exoragusis. I can't even say that second word, right? The two forms of confession that he works out, right? So there is an attention to religion in some of the later works, but there is a way in which the displacement of religion in those salient texts where he's talking about the polymorphous nature of power sort of leaves open a possibility for us to reread him critically. And that's the kind of work that I would want to do going forward, and I hope we can do in religious studies going forward. So I won't go back over the defense of genealogy, which boils down to a few points that I think we're all familiar with, right? That genealogy treats as historical concepts, ideas, forms of experience that we might presume to be ahistorical, that it gives up on teleological explanations in the writing of history, and that because it pays close attention to power dynamics, it has a certain potential for demystification, for demystifying power structures. But instead, let's come back to the concept of counter memory for a second. Foucault defines the counter memory as, and this is his phrase, the transformation of history into a totally different form of time. That's about as much as we get from Foucault on what a counter memory is. So what the hell does that mean, right? What a transformation of history into a totally different form of time. What does he have in mind when he's talking about a counter memory? It seems to me, another thing to say, the only other comment we get from Foucault about what a counter memory is that he says that it gives new impetus to the work of freedom, right? So the transformation of history into a totally different form of time, and a transformation that gives new impetus to the work of freedom. That seems like as abstract and as indeterminate as one can get, right? So what does he have in mind? It strikes me that these formulations only make sense if we put them back into or understand them as part of his own reading of Nietzsche. and his claim that what Nietzsche is doing is disabusing himself and us of what Foucault calls a Platonic mode of historical thinking, right? So the way Foucault understands Nietzschean genealogy to work, of course, is that it reveals to us that history always, the writing of history and historical thinking tend to reintroduce and assume, often surreptitiously, a super-historical perspective in two forms. One, that it attributes to history a form of reconciliation, which gathers together all displacements of the past, right? That is a kind of anamnesis. And two, that it assumes a relation to the past that takes for granted a completed development. That is, it assumes something like the possibility of absolute knowing. So for Foucault, he says that the historian's history finds its support outside history, and it claims to base judgments on what he calls an apocalyptic objective, or some treatment of history, some reading of the past that assumes a closure in the present that allows us to speak the truth of the past, that allows us to imagine that we have in the present the truth of the past, right? So for Foucault, I think this shores up the myth of sovereignty, to use that language that we've been using this afternoon, in two forms. One, the belief in eternal truths, or that there are such things as eternal truths, and two, that it shores up the belief that consciousness itself is something self-identical and is something that doesn't change over time. The nature of consciousness is set. So there you have absolute knowledge and memory as anamnesis, right? So I understand Foucault in articulating this nature very in an indefinite way, right? The notion of counter-memory, to be dismantling what he takes to be the great tasks of 19th century philosophy, 19th and 20th century philosophy. The two tasks are trying to articulate the reciprocal basis of freedom and truth in form of in Fichte's idealism, for instance, but also the possibility of absolute knowledge, Hegel. So counter-memory is memory insofar as it's no longer tagged to the myth of sovereignty. It's disconnected from the myth of sovereignty that defines what Foucault is calling the historian's history. So if you imagine that memory itself as a faculty of the mind, or collective or individual, memory itself is tagged to this historian's history, then the counter-memory for Foucault would be a memory without memory, right? That it would be something other than a faculty that would lead into, that would shore up belief in eternal truths or the self-identity of consciousness, right? So, in essence, I think that Foucault would say that counter-memory is what happens to the concept of memory when the will to truth loses all sense of limitation and all claims to truth. That is to say, it's what happens to the concept of memory when the freedom of inquiry is unshackled from the historian's history. In essence, this is Foucault's way of saying that our first goal as philosophers, as people who reflect philosophically, should be to turn ourselves into experiments, to experiment with ourselves, to find new ways of being human. Now, when I wrote this piece, I had, let's say, a hidden interlocutor in mind, and that is, some of you may be familiar with Thomas A. Lewis, Tal Lewis's book, Why Philosophy Matters for the Study of Religion, and vice versa. And at the end of that book, you get a definition of philosophy, what philosophy is and should be in religious studies, as follows, that philosophy of religion is the self-conscious reflection on and critique of categories and concepts through which we study religion. So that's Tal's definition. And let me just say that I have an enormous amount of respect for Tal Lewis. I think of him as a friend and as somebody who has been a mentor to me. But in the spirit of productive disagreement, I would say that there are certain reasons why I'm a little uneasy with that definition. But the reason why I bring it up is that in giving us that definition of what philosophy of religion should be, Tal mounts this very strong defense of Hegel as our model for what philosophical reflection should be in religious studies. And he mounts that defense against the other option, which would be Nietzschean genealogy. Now, what I would like to do is suggest that, in fact, it's the Nietzschean option that we should take, and that offers, I think, the most, for me, the most promising way forward in the philosophy of religion. What Tal's trying to do at the end of that book on philosophy of religion is to say that there must be some defense of normativity in the study of religion. That is, we must defend normative claims, and we must defend them on the basis of critical historical work, right? So there must be some invocation of normativity in the study of religion. As an ethicist, Tal is saying this, and he's nervous about genealogy for the reasons that I think a lot of people are nervous about genealogy. One, that some people fear that it's necessarily relativistic. Two, that some people fear that it exhausts itself in, let's say, undermining our categories and our conceptual resources rather than giving us new ones, right? And the third reason is that he's worried it's nihilistic. What I see these concerns, I grant them as serious ones that we need to think about. But there's a concern that I have that I think goes unarticulated at the end of that book, which is that it could be, and I'm nervous in making this claim because I know that some of you may disagree with it, but my sense is that from Foucault's perspective at least, the invocation of normativity will never be able to free itself from what Foucault calls the historian's history. That is, it'll never be able to free itself from the myth of sovereignty. It will always be haunted by the myth of sovereignty. So there are certain ways I think it's worth considering the possibility, I'll put this as tentatively as possible. It's worth considering the possibility that the invocation of normativity in philosophical reflection on religious studies forestalls the freedom of inquiry. That it makes it impossible in some way to imagine new ways of living and new ways and new styles and cultivating new styles of reason, right? So I guess I'll just, I'm conscious of the hour, so I will just end by saying, by coming back to Amy Hollywood's piece, when she says, for instance, that Foucault has displaced religion and religiosity in his work, I think that's true, and I think we can see it in his account of what it means to live experimentally, since there are so many times where he talks about sacrificing or destroying what he calls the subject of connaissance, and that very logic of sacrifice, I think, can easily be related and should be related genealogically to a discussion of reform, redemption, and salvation that is Christian in character and that is submitted to a very careful analysis in both Kant and Hegel's texts. So there are ways in which Foucault's own account of what it means to experiment with ourselves is indebted to Christianity in ways that he can't quite see, right? So when I wrote this piece, and I'll end on this note. When I wrote this piece, I was still hopeful that what we could see in Foucault were resource of what we could take from Foucault would be resources for actually using the polymorphous nature of power to imagine new possibilities of being human. Right? That was what I really had in mind. I am less optimistic about that now for two reasons. One is I've spent the last 3 years thinking about the ways in which, not in the discourse of power, but when it comes to metaphysics, that the term metaphysics, if we just substitute in metaphysics for power, power for metaphysics, if we just, for the sake of argument, take them as perhaps convertible terms there, then I've been thinking about the fact that in those figures in the Western European, modern Western or continental European philosophical tradition, those thinkers who commit themselves to destroying metaphysics, the great destroyers, right? Nietzsche, Freud, and Heidegger, the masters of suspicion as well, as it were. If you just take Freud out of the mix for a second, Nietzsche and Heidegger articulate these powerful discourses of destruction, and yet they both, in the end, come to an experience of no exit. Right? So, and that, I think, is an indication of the polymorphous nature of metaphysics, and by extension, the polymorphous nature of power, but it's also an indication that power and metaphysics are not just polymorphous, but they are able to make use of their own amorphousness in order to shut down what look like exits from their systems of totality. Right? And it's this experience of no exit that I've been studying for the past two or 3 years now. And so this leads me to, I have some responses to the questions that Kevin raised at the outset, but I'll put them aside for now to just say this. I wonder now, I think it is, we absolutely should be thinking about the polymorphous nature of power. And I completely agree with Amy that the combination of Agamben and Foucault, is it a cookie or a sandwich? I forget. A sandwich cookie, yeah, is problematic. And maybe, one of the things that makes it possible is precisely the way in which Foucault himself articulates this notion of experimentation in language that I think is indebted to Christian theology, right? The logic of sacrifice. I agree that this is deeply problematic, but I wonder if we have today the concept of power that can articulate what's going on and the ways in which power, even if we're not talking about domination or sovereignty, we're talking about power in polymorphous terms. What we see, I think, today is that expressions of power and this experience of no exit are such that any forms of resistance that are made possible by power structures today are immediately reabsorbed into the structures themselves, right? And so it's that experience of paralysis within the economy of power that I'm thinking about, and I'm wondering if we have the conceptual resources to adequately describe for ourselves how power works today. We are 40 years out from the concept of biopower. We are 80 years out, as it were, from the concept in Heidegger of Machenschafft or Gestell. So it may be the case that we need to rethink power in much more radical terms, even if that's in relation to, or not even if, it has to be, I would say, in relation to figures like Foucault and Nietzsche. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
And if I put this up, will that one, Tiffany, are you here? The slide I was going to put up for the poem, is that available? Okay. All right. Wonderful. All right, well, while that's starting, I'm going to say thank you so much, of course, to Tiffany and to Emily and to everyone involved at the Marty Center and to here at the Divinity School, and especially, of course, to Sarah for gathering us in the volume, gathering us here today. So I'm the last speaker. I think maybe we could all just give ourselves a round of applause for being here today. Okay, great. And as the last speaker, oh, thanks. And maybe I can just go to that third. Perfect. We'll just leave it up there, I think. And as the last speaker, I do think I have a couple of things that I would like to, or that I sort of think is incumbent upon the last speaker, which is in some way to hold together all of us in some sense the day that we've just had, beginning with Sarah's opening remarks and beginning with, Sam, I'm trying to thank you for modeling for us the possibility of multiple sources for what it is we're going to say. I have rewritten mine a couple of times over the course of today, and it will be very coherent and very short, and be very afraid whenever a professor says that they're going to talk short, because it never ever comes true. So you've all been warned. But I also think there's so many things to think about from the beginning of the day. And as we've had along the way, so I hope that we are all gathering those thoughts. And as I speak to a couple of things that then are just brought up by my fellow panelists, it's a great delight to be with you both here. So one thing, as I'm thinking, just to frame the idea of the question of faith, which I want you all to know at the outset is the outlier term. How do I know that? Because one of the readers said so. It's like, oh, that was the one theological term in the volume. There were no theological terms in the first volume, and there are no other theological terms in this volume. But somehow I am not a theologian, but I somehow wrote a piece that was seemingly recognizably a piece of theology. It should also be an outlier because I want you all to know none of us in religious studies should be talking about faith. That is what I learned with absolute clarity as an undergraduate. I learned that actually, interestingly, right after reading Wilfred Cantwell Smith's book, A Meaning and End of Religion, which I assume most of you under 50 did not ever read, for the following reason. Because he tells us that, in fact, religion is the problem. The institution, the fact that it's the reification of this concept is the problem. And so what it is we can have as a solution is faith. I was like, oh, that's cool. That's really interesting. And the whole thing for me about studying religion is like ideas I'd never thought of before. I did not grow up as a person of faith. I did not understand myself to be a religious person as I grew up. And I got to college and I was like, you know what? These Fellowship of Christian Athletes, people that I knew in high school who I did not think were doing a lot of really interesting things, have this really interesting tradition that's doing all kinds of fascinating things that just continually surprise me over and over and over again. So for me, the experience of wanting to study religion was just the experience of being surprised by how complicated it was, how many other worlds it could make possible for us to see. And Rafe, I'm thinking very much about your idea of epistemicide and the way that, so many forms of knowledge are not available to us. And for me, the experience of studying religion is the continual confrontation with, well, maybe they reason differently. Maybe the gods are actually in the concrete. Maybe it is the blood that matters and not the words. Just endlessly exciting and interesting. So for me, I'm like Wilfred Cantwell Smith says, faith is the thing. I didn't immediately think spiritual, not religious. I thought faith, But let us all be clear that it is, of course, faith is the evidence of Protestantism's overdetermined effect on religious studies. And so then what did I decide to do when I got to the Divinity School? Kind of on a fluke, because I had studied early Christianity and I'd studied modernity and actually Jewish thought when I was an undergraduate. And I was like, and then I got here and I ended up studying the Reformation. And I was like, okay, what do you know? It turns out what I can learn about in the Reformation is I can learn a lot about faith. And what I mostly have learned over the course of my I've been in this business long enough to no longer want to say how many decades I've been in this business, and it's not a business, in this exciting, important experience of inquiry, is I have learned that I don't really understand faith. I still don't really understand faith, which is one of the reasons I was really excited when Sarah, who is astute in so many ways, because I had proposed in some other context that we would talk about faith. And then when we were on the board and talking about all these words that are available to all in everyday life. And Sarah said, well, of course, you'll be writing on faith. I'm like, oh, okay, well, that sounds like a good kind of surprising assignment. I'll try that. And it has been a really exciting and interesting assignment. And I will remind us all that regret has wended its way through the day as from the very first panel. And I certainly have, as I read my own essay, other thoughts about things that are, let us say, underdeveloped in this. But I will then also remind, just as I was thinking about faith as something that can be a collective, is to remind us that that is the actually interesting thing about this kind of volume, is it is an invitation to us all, whatever we you want to name, but let us name this we in this room right now, to us all, scholars of religion or people who are just in some way interested in religion, to experiment with whatever suggestions we might have made. And so I thank you, Ryan, for that call to experimentation, and for me, a revelatory way of thinking about genealogy, but also your invocation of that here. And so I would propose to you all that faith can be a type of experimentation and invitation to experimentation. And I presume that that does not necessarily land as an obvious way to think about what faith can be. I also think faith, then invoking, going back to the first panel, can be a way to overcome binaries, and it can be a storehouse of surprises. And I think that this should be a tall order to make this argument to you, especially because I plan to make the argument with a Protestant. So, in fact, an early modern Protestant. Remember that early modern period where all the problems came from? And one of the English Protestants, George Herbert, who is someone who gives us, I just went to some of my sources, some of my Protestant sources, and I went to an obvious poem, because the poem has the title Faith. So I thought, let me see what I can find from that poem. And it turns out that what I find is things that are, I think, very much in keeping with what we'd expect from Protestant faith. I'm assuming probably almost everyone in this room has a one-liner on Protestant faith, which is it is internal and personal. And it's about spiritualizing rather than the materiality and stuffness, as Matthew was reminding us earlier from Bynum, the stuffness of religion. And so it seems you can read that poem. If that's what you know about faith, you can read this poem, and you can absolutely find that in this poem. But if you spend some time with this poem, it just gets weirder and weirder. And it becomes, I mean, weird is a little bit, that was an easy one to say, because I would think that would sound interesting to you. It doesn't necessarily get weirder and weirder, but it does get complicated in ways that I think are a little bit surprising. And one of those ways is, for example, just this opening stanza. Lord, how couldst thou so much appease thy wrath for sin, as when man's sight was dim and could see little to regard his case, and bring by faith all things to him. Okay, faith, it does everything that religious people needed to do. It's a get out of, life free card. It's a get out of all kinds of problems, kinds of card. But, one of the things to notice is the question mark. The other thing to notice is the direct address. There is, on one hand, a clear and obvious claim that this speaker is not doing anything. The speaker is just getting what they need from God. Protestant theology. On the other hand, there is this beginning of this very convoluted syntax of this opening claim, and the fact that it is, in fact, is a question. How can it bring all things? And that, I think, is an interesting question, that it begins for those 11 more stanzas that go on, where there is all these claims, again, that sound like spiritualized claims. Faith makes you healthier. Faith makes you more prosperous. Faith makes you, it solves all of the kinds of health problems that you might have. It solves all of the social problems that you might have. In fact, it will give you a way of experiencing lowliness and servitude. It will give you a way of experiencing your own sort of independent sovereignty, to use that word. It will give you a way of occupying kind of all the positions there are to occupy. And it will sort of make it all right in some way. And yet, if we start, as for example, the online editors of one of the versions of this poem tell us, make sure you read this spiritually, not materially. But if you think for a moment, maybe I shouldn't read it that way, then you're in the position of, if you all remember from the talk on belief, from the first volume's entry on belief, and we have Peter of Verona writing in blood, credo, I believe, and then Matthew says, wait, it might have been the blood that's more important than the word. Well, it turns out in this poem, the blood and the word are both important. So it does break down these binaries between the spirit and matter, and between the individual subject and this transcendent God, between this idea of being actively responsible for and able to control your fate, your health, your wealth, and so forth, and being someone who is, in fact, totally subject to forces beyond your control. Is anyone feeling any sense of recognition at this moment? Right? We are, in fact, subject to forces beyond our control. And we have so many ways of knowing and not knowing, and handling and not handling, and rightly thinking that isn't the whole story, and also having to grapple with the way that that is the whole story. And there is a way that this exploration by this very, very, orthodox, early modern Protestant poet gives us some sense of that complexity of a relational dynamic of faith that I think has some expressive engagement with the relational dynamic, which is the necessary and inescapable feature of being human, which is to anticipate the question about what category or definition of the human I'm interested in this entry. In my actual critical terms entry, I go on to do, of course, how many case studies? 3. I think I did sneak in a 4th one there. Actually, Alireza is so interesting and fascinating. You may not realize this because it was so many years ago, but the fact that that you ended by saying actually you would be interested in thinking about unreason alongside reason, but your work was one of the whole reasons I was interested in thinking about faith in the first place. So there is a little bit of a coming full circle in seeing that. Not just in these Protestant contexts, but in these other contexts. And I think I got to the study of Coptic Christianity from your bibliography, I believe. So I have these 3 case studies in other contexts for thinking about whether it is in 20th century Iran or in Coptic Christianity in contemporary Egypt, so both by anthropologists or by a Buddhist commentator who is thinking about faith. Each of them willing to use the terminology of faith, which is, obviously a term that has limitations in its translatability, and of course is a necessity for us to have terms that have translatability and that can be used transculturally to think about things in different times and places. And each of them I see different ways of understanding how faith plays out. All of them, I hope, and I am wagering, and I invite you all to experiment with, to see that if we again are willing to use the term faith, we might be prepared to see some dynamics that we might not otherwise see. This is actually, as Martin Riesebrot, one of the great teachers here at the Divinity School, used to remind us about Weber, he loved this statement about Weber's methodology, is that the evidence you look at is determined by the question that you ask. So if we are asking questions of faith, it is true. It will guide us to see certain things. It is crucial that we understand the dangers of what faith has traditionally and continues to occlude. I do go through all of that. I'm not going to go back through all of that here right now because I do think some of that's been invoked as in the ways in which people have rightly named Protestantism's negative consequences for the study of religion in the way that it has really narrowed our vision. And the real life consequences for those of us who remember back to the Bush era, even just thinking about faith-based, initiatives or whatever, faith-based initiatives, or, and Assad is so astute on this. And the reason we're still reading Assad is because he is so astute on these exact kinds of things. Something like Wilford Cantwell Smith saying, really it is about faith. When Cantwell Smith says in a Protestant vein, oh, that is about someone, me naked before God, Assad rightly says, he's the one who says it clearly. It's not that so many people were out there saying it. Is that he says there is a way that is a claim of equality, which in fact conceals inequality. So those are just as one example, of course, of the dangers of faith. Meaning, I hope that we shouldn't just say, of course, because it is important to remind ourselves of exactly what those dangers are. And yet to say that this is a danger I think we should dance with. And I think that I think in faith, the question of whether it has a critical edge is one I hope that we will begin to talk about. Whether I think it can be a source of experimentation is one I hope that I have in some way persuasively suggested here. And then the idea that it can be offered for us not as a definition. Interesting then here in this panel to think about what is it that is valuable about having a kind of Geertzian definition, and what is frustrating and potentially valuable about very much not, and just saying, wait, what if we open up the question of faith? But to argue not as a definition, but just as a proposition, that faith is a way of thinking about social reality, power dynamics, psychological, epistemological, sociological, economic, and spiritual understandings of the lived experience. Sorry, that's not a phrase I wanted to use, but I'm using it anyway, because it's late in the day and I didn't nail that one exactly. But what I wanted to say is that there's a way that this relational dynamic evades the kind of capture of clear, distinctive categories among all of those things that I just named. And faith then might make it possible, and then here I borrow, of course, from a poet, which is, in a sense, cheating, but in a sense speaks to what I think, Matt, you were saying about the importance of how things are represented. It matters in terms of how that does change our reality and our perceptions of it. So we will say with him, that with faith, that which before was dark and clean, with bushy groves pricking the looker's eye, vanished away when faith did change the scene, and then appeared a glorious sky. What, though my body run to dust, faith cleaves unto it, counting every grain with an exact and most particular trust, reserving all for flesh again. To speak then to the three questions very briefly. A, the human, yes, I think that for me it does speak to notions of the human. I do think it is crucial not to be thinking about the human as something we can define, but instead as an open question, that religion is a crucial resource for asking. B, are we offering a transcultural definition? Again, this is the terminology of it's a critical term in the Weberian, Alireza wrote, sort of way of approaching this, is that the term faith prepares us to do, I hope, some interesting and important creative and theoretical, comparative work. And finally, what mattering does our method have? What does our method matter? And absolutely, it clearly matters, and everybody should ask about that, because our three different methods are quite different and do have quite significant implications for the kinds of conclusions that we have drawn and the way that we have drawn these conclusions. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank you very much to all three of the speakers. This is by far the most organic conference I've ever seen, and it's not close, right? Where people are interacting with one another and constructing their ideas with others in mind as we go. There's none of this, I wrote this paper ahead of time, so I'm darn well gonna read the paper I wrote ahead of time, right? There's just much more interaction, and there's something that is being built as you go, which I just really admire, and I appreciate the way you've done that. So we have less than 20 minutes left. I am intent on getting you out on time. So the promise, though, was that we would start with a chance for the three of you to reflect a little bit on maybe some themes that have bubbled up or things you wanted to pursue that have come up in one another's papers, right? And then we can have a bit of time for question and answer. And you all by now know the procedure. If you would like to ask a question, we would ask you just to queue over there. Then we'll know who's up, and we'll also be able to make sure we get your voice recorded and amplified for everyone. So, but first, a chance to hear from the three of you again. Yes.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to both of you. So I just have a kind of a prompt / suggestion that comes out of thinking a little bit with Matt's earlier question to the previous panel about resistance and representation. And I got to think about it when, Ryan, you were talking about experimentation, and when Constance again picked up the question of experimentation. And I'm trying to think about experimentation in relation to resistance. And what Matt's question brought to my mind was a point that Frantz Fanon makes in The Wretched of the Earth. And I've been kind of really thinking about this because I taught him in the fall, and I'm teaching him again this quarter. There's a point he makes in the chapter on national culture that that national culture is not something to be sought in the past. It's actually something, I mean, he talks about how the kinds of cultural representations that come out of valorizing past history and the grandeur of old and civilization and so on, that's all useless and really it just reproduces backwardness and fascism and so on. And what actually we should be looking for is the way that culture is produced in the course of revolutionary struggle. So it cannot be detached from action, in other words. It can't be this kind of intellectual exercise that is taking place separate from the actual kind of material practice. And I wanted to think about that in relation to, I mean, so when you were talking about, Matt, when you were talking about representation, and I think also the question that came up about scholarly practice, I think Rafe maybe asked, or made a point about scholarly practice. To me, it occurs that one of the problems of scholarly practice is individualism. You know, I mean, and you know, and the kind of the sort of the competitive capitalist mode of, you know,
scary that's a revelation.
Right, yeah, and exactly, and I wonder though, how can we think about sort of representation in relation to resistance, but somehow connecting it to collectivity. And I don't have an answer for this, but partly I'm thinking about this because maybe to go back to Ryan's piece, you know, in your essay you bring up the way that collective memory has been one of the sites where memory has been explored, and you know, maybe there's a way in which collective memory can be linked up to some kind of conception of collective experimentation. What I don't know so much, and what I don't see so much, is Foucault giving us tools to think about collective experimentation, even though he was clearly seeing and being sort of inspired by collective modes of experimentation, whether that's in the gay subculture of San Francisco in the 70s, or, you know, there's an argument that's made about his observation of the Iranian Revolution that also had something to do with his formulation of ideas of political spirituality. So I wonder if you both, and I'm putting this on you, can help us think about collectivity in relation to experimentation and resistance.
Great, thank you so much. I mean, you know, it seems the right question to be asking, and you know, I was really struck by Rafe's question in the last session. You know, not only you know, about how we're theorizing power in the present, but you know, what does it mean to be studying ancient and medieval, you know, pre-modern cultures? And you know, I guess I would respond, you know, in a way that is unfortunately disconcerting. Which is that, you know, and here I would defer to you know, specialists on Foucault, because I have my, you know, reading of the sort of trajectory that Foucault follows, starting from archaeology and genealogy, going to the question of governmentality and hermeneutics. But I do wonder if precisely the focus on hermeneutics of the subject and on experimentation is, you know, that focus is set against the background of an increasingly pessimistic view about collective action in Foucault. That could be mistaken. That's how I'm reading him now. And I admit that in reading him in that way, I'm folding him into this narrative I have about the sort of the great destroyers and how they themselves wind up in a situation of no exit. For me, perhaps I'm thinking about this in too abstract terms. And one of the things I so deeply appreciate about both of your pieces and your work is that you're not doing that, right? You're actually embodying for me what I think, the sort of the role of philosophical reflection in the study of religion can be. One of the reasons why I'm nervous about the definition of philosophy as the self-conscious criticism of the categories in the study of religion is that that seems to me to set up philosophical reflection as a kind of policing, a police action, a policing of concepts and categories, but also of disciplinary boundaries, right? So it reinscribes again the myth of sovereignty. I don't think one can do that if one is practicing the philosophy of religion in what I take to be a rigorous way, because we are always attentive to the genitive, right? The relationship, we're trying to be critical about the relationship between, in the traditions I work in, the constitution of philosophy as a discourse vis-a-vis these, theological traditions. The ways in which philosophy is constituted by trying to exclude religion along with other theoretical discourses. So I'm thinking in those terms, but for me, there's something helpful about the fact that philosophy cannot play that role and should not be playing that role of like policing boundaries and disciplines. And yet I wind up, I'm in this position where I think that I keep coming up against this experience of no exit. This is the sense that there may be sites of resistance, but that are being explored in Foucault, in Derrida, in Nietzsche and Heidegger. But in fact, one of the things that's really interesting about those corpuses, or I'll just stick to Nietzsche and Heidegger for a moment, is that precisely when they want to denounce religion, they think of it as in privative terms, right? So Nietzsche thinks of the Judeo-Christian not just as a form of weakness, his words, not mine, obviously, but of non-power, right? He says in the Antichrist, and I think there's a theory of power in the 1888 text of Nietzsche that's not consonant exactly with the texts that come before, where he says something like, when the will to power is lacking, that's when you get what he calls Niedergang. You get this decline, and that's religion. That's the Judeo-Christian. And so he begins to develop this sense of something that seems to be outside of power and yet is shoring up power structures. And that's always coded in terms of religion in these texts. Heidegger too, the power of Ungeschichte or non-history. That's the first use of that term, and Machenschaft, the first use of the term in Heidegger, is to describe Christianity, right? So I'm in this position where I'm trying to think about the situation of no exit and the ways in which sites of resistances are reabsorbed into power structures. But I admit that that's a limiting horizon, and I feel that very profoundly. And so that's why I'm also trying to counterbalance it with this sense of experimentation. That's why I so appreciated both Rafe's question and Amy's presentation.
Your question was? Oh, collectivity,
yeah. Right. I mean, so you think about, you talk about faith as being relational.
Yeah.
You don't say it so much in terms of collectivity.
Right, because I think, this, of course, and for those of you who want to think about the coherence of the volume and the way that this is emerging over the course of today, but also through the reading. Katie goes to systems of worship, right? Systems is one form of collectivity. And you say, Katie, you have the challenge of studying religion is not its definition, but the evaluation of forms of relation it propounds. The challenge of studying religion is not the definition, but the evaluation of the forms of relation it propounds. And I think this is exactly as you're saying. The experimentation is that our sources are doing.
Right.
Our sources are doing some of the experimentation that we are seeking for ourselves.
Right. I missed that.
My distinct sense is that the next edition of this volume is going to be written during dinner tonight. I don't see anybody in the queue just yet. I'll ask questions so people can get lined up. Alireza, you were very scrupulous to talk about reason is important, but it's not everything. And what it's not is actually really important, right? And you gestured in the direction of certain kinds of faith practices and so forth, right? But you were very keen on talking about what is other than the term that you were sort of writing about. Ryan, you did something similar, right? Memory is important, but there's this thing that is other than memory as it tends to function. That's really important, right? Counter memory of different sorts. I find it interesting that, Constance, you were essentially told that your term is other than, right, the stuff of this text, but it's also, the way you characterize it, it sounds very much like you're the one who is writing about the stuff that is other than these other terms, so that it plays a unique role, at least on this panel, but maybe within the book. I don't know if you want to claim that or if you want to reflect on it, whether that's important. I mean, this is your chance to say, it's not the outlier, in fact, it's the center of the whole endeavor.
It's not the outlier, it's the center of the whole endeavor.
And Constance Furey wins. That's great. All right.
Well, my question I think has come up already. I was thinking about this also collectivity, right? That is experimentation as a kind of philosophy, kind of intention with this discursive activity of creating a life together, right? If everyone's kind of experimenting, how do you get at something that everyone can understand that allows a life together? And I guess maybe the author that came to mind, and I don't know how often he studied in religious studies, but Montaigne seems to spend a lot of time thinking about, philosophy as experience and gaining a lot of new experiences. But when he does think about things that relate to life together, it is interesting that habit and custom played a kind of important role for him. But I think those then, I don't think they're quite sovereignty, but they have a kind of stability, or there's something about them that you accept that I don't think you would call polymorphous. But yeah, I just wonder if Montaigne is someone to think with around this problem.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much for that question.
Can I start just by saying thank you so much? And we all have moments today, I think we felt moved. But anyway, Susan Schreiner, who was the Reformation scholar here, was my teacher. One of her books ends with Montaigne. He's her answer. So we can talk about polymorphous power, but I just wanted to name that's one scholar of religion who very much saw his centrality.
Yep. Thoughts, though, about the way experimentation could become part of a kind of collective life, right? I mean, this does seem important.
I have one thought, which is just a reference, which is Kristen Ross's work on the commune form. I mean, what she's trying to argue for is looking at the communes, from the Paris Commune onward, as a site precisely of experimenting how to live in a way that is different from and an antidote to the capitalist mode of living.
Yeah, good. It's a really good question, though. I appreciate that. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks to all the panelists. Appreciate this. All great, awesome. Two of my favorite terms or phrases are experimentation and polymorphous perversity. So I'm going to try and put these two things together. And I got to thinking about the context of Freud's coinage, which was a discussion of, eroticism, sexuality, and then love comes to mind. And first of all, Professor Hammerschlag, was there an entry on love in the? Okay, so I just wondered about love, because I don't think we've talked a whole lot about love today, and this is going to be cheesy, but fuck it. I'm wondering about, and this comes maybe Professor Hollywood, if you don't mind reflecting on this, but then this is a question for anyone, everyone. Maybe something on the polymorphous power of love, what this might suggest about experimental modes of writing, scholarship, and life.
Thank you for that. Panelists, the gauntlet has been thrown down.
As briefly as possible. It's a really interesting question of Freud, right? Not only love in the context of the discussion of sexuality, of course, and the discourse surrounding love and hate in three essays, but also when he juxtaposes Eros and Thanatos in the later work, and the comments he makes in Beyond the Pleasure Principle about the polymorphous nature of love. It's probably too late to develop that right now, but I would love to hear your opinions and your thoughts about that, Jeremy, because I'm sure you have a lot more to say about it than I would.
Good. So I think, Professor Hammerschlag, you were next in the queue, right? What's that? You want to go last? I think you're last. I mean, we're at the end of our time for the most part.
Maybe, could we just maybe collect the two questions and then Sarah, you ask yours? Just. Okay.
All right. So please step on up and we can hear your question at least.
So I have a question to Professor Furey. So first, I really like this idea about faith. I really like that term. However, I would maybe you implied this already, but would you define faith as a practice, or it's more like a dogma? In other words, what would be the subject of faith? Would that be a God or divinity or a way of life or religion per se? Because I myself study comparative study of religion, and I just want to ask you: do you think those non-Abrahamic religion also have their faith? I was thinking about this morning's Professor McLaughlin's slide at the end is a Japanese term for faith, shin. So it can mean to trust or to believe it, but it does not necessarily mean to have a faith in an Abrahamic God.
Yes, and hopefully the volume which uses one example of a non-Abrahamic example would be just speaking to exactly what you're speaking to, and what Levy's slide. Where are you? There you are. Would make possible. Yes. Yeah, so there are that, and then the question of whether it becomes a useful way or an illuminating way to study these phenomena is a question that depends on each case study and the particularities. But I think the short answer is I think yes.
Good. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for those great talks. I have a little question for each of you. Sorry, but I think they could be brief or get to the methodological question for this panel. My question's kind of about how states of consciousness might play into this. So for Professor Doostdar, I was thinking about how reason and rationality gets kind of collapsed or normalized as ego consciousness in like normal parlance or our current society. And if you were actively disentangling that with some psychoanalytic or ontological methods about how different states of consciousness allow for different types of reasons, or if that was kind of in the background with intuitive reason and you were focused more on kind of human discursivity after that. And for Professor Furey, I liked your point of different questions lead to different types of evidence that we might not otherwise see. But with faith, you're also dealing with evidence that's hard to see or by nature you can't see. So how you deal with that. And for Professor Coyne, I was curious how, what the interplay might be between counter-memory and the counter-sciences in Foucault, and how religion might kind of be able to, religious studies could be a place to occupy or kind of disentangle that so that we can move away from those kind of like the normative collapse that you were talking about.
Maybe very brief responses.
Yeah, I think the question you raise is extremely interesting, and I don't really get into it. I mean, I think as far as the intuitive is concerned, the use that I end up making of it is the way that intuitive modes of apprehension are themselves socially cultivated and taught, and the way that they then can undergird certain modes of discursive reasoning and the apprehension of discursive reasoning. The questions that you raise are extremely interesting, and I think maybe something to pick up on in relation to this.
Agreed, and maybe we can talk a little about it a little bit afterward as well, but I will just say, I don't think that it is as different from other phenomena as we might think. In the necessity of the unseen being essential to it.
I'll just say very briefly, fantastic suggestion. And I think that's exactly the way in which I would want to pursue it. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to take the editor's prerogative of closing the conversation just a tiny bit more. First of all, thank you, Constance, for coming up on the fly with such a beautiful, real synthesis of today. And I'm grateful for all of you for thinking together. But, I did begin today by kind of with a provocation that I think that the study of religion has a special role to play in humanistic thinking in a time of crisis. And I'm so grateful, too, to Alireza for bringing up this idea of collective experimentation. I guess what's been running through my head listening to you all and trying to figure out how to bring this to a close is that, and thinking about what happened here today, and Kevin, your comment about the organic nature of this conference really just solidifies for me what's at stake here. I think those of us who are educated in the study of religion, one of the things we're told ad nauseum is that the thing about religion is that it has no unifying object, it has no unifying method. In fact, it seems to have nothing to unify it at all. And there's this sense that therefore we're all going to be scrambling over definitions. But I think, when I said today that I think it's the fact that what we do is that we work on traditions with a lowercase t, what I meant is, and I think Amy, you mentioned this too, the way in which we all are actually occupied with these parochial moments across the globe and in different moments of history, but actually we do have a shared endeavor and a shared set of concepts. And yes, we're still experimenting with them. And yes, we're still creating them. And yes, they're going to change. I heard so many people today speak of regret and hopelessness. But what I experienced today was the extraordinary power of the way we have been trained to speak together across space and time, across specialties of space and time, and to actually have a kind of openness and Katie said this too to me in a moment between sessions, that there is a kind of playfulness, a kind of ability to take ourselves just a tad bit less seriously, knowing that in fact what we are participating in is a form, I think, of collective experimentation. So thank you all for participating with me in what I think is absolutely a collective experiment.
So just to close out the panel, I want to thank our panelists again. I want to thank you all for really, really thoughtful questions. And one more time, I think we should thank Professor Hammerschlag for making this happen. Really great.